It is so wonderful to see everybody here this morning. It may be a little chilly outside, but we bring so much warmth here into the small chapel, and I know some of you are joining us on live stream, and we're happy to have you with us as well. This is such a wonderful morning because I know for many it's about a moment of reconnecting and being together in community. And I am truly honored to be able to share this program this morning. And for those who might not know me, I'm Rabbi Sue Shankman. It gives me great pride to welcome you to our Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series. As many of you know, the Amram Scholar Series offers a stimulating program of free lectures throughout the year in which world-renowned speakers, authors, scholars, political leaders, policy analysts, theologians, and yes, even rabbis, share their perspectives on timely issues and their research into history, whether on a broader plane or as will be the case today, the personal story and its relevance for all of us. This program traces its beginnings to the fall of 1954, when Washington Hebrew moved here to our Macomb Street home. That fall, participating in a nationwide celebration that marked the 300th anniversary of Jewish settlement in the United States, Washington Hebrew launched what would become this widely recognized Sunday morning lecture program. We are celebrating our 70th year of the Amram Scholar Series. Today's lecture is also in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. At the end of our time together in the chapel, there will be an opportunity for you to purchase the book, From the West to the East by Rabbi John Rosove, and even have it signed by our author. And so we hope that you'll take advantage of that as well. Today's Amram lecture is sponsored, in addition to being in partnership with the Jewish Book Council, it is also sponsored by the Leo and Elizabeth Goodman Public Issues Fund. Leo and Elizabeth Goodman were activists throughout their lives, both professionally and in their personal lives. Both natives of the Boston area, Boston's a great town, especially for anyone going to college there next year. They met when they served as fellow volunteer adult leaders of the Boy and Girl Scout troops, respectively, at Boston's Settlement House. Leo was an Eagle Scout. Elizabeth was pursuing her master's degree in social work at Simmons College. They married the day after Elizabeth was awarded her master's degree, and they moved here to Washington, D.C. to join Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Leo spent his career as a union lobbyist advocating for fair housing and nuclear safety, while Elizabeth spent hers developing and heading programs for children with special needs as principal of DC's Sharp Health School and visiting instruction corps, and later in the Office for Exceptional Children at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. They were active in civil rights. They attended Marian Anderson's concert in 1939 at the Lincoln Memorial after she was barred from performing at DAR Constitution Hall. They were back at the Lincoln Memorial for the 1963 March on Washington, where they heard Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Once retired, Leo served on WHC's Social Action Committee, and where's Joan? No, wrong Joan, other Joan, Churchill. Sorry, one of our current chairs, along with Kathy Shineson of our committee. We'll get to you in a moment, Joan Churchill. Leo served on WHC's Social Action Committee and was particularly active helping Iranian Jewish immigrants after the Iranian Revolution led to a takeover by religious extremists. They had an inspirational effect on their children and grandchildren. Many of us know their daughters, Joan and Lois, for their contributions, particularly through our Community Issues Social Action Committee and our Empty Nesters Inside the Issues, among other programs. In fact, just this week, Joan also brought to us a conversation with Jamie Raskin. Lois was encouraged at age 14 to join sit-ins at Glen Echo. We've heard a lot about that this year, certainly with Alana Trachtman's film as well, and also sit-ins at Woolworths. Joan pursued a career as an immigration lawyer and judge, and I believe their brother Maury, who's a 1966 WHC confirmand, is joining us on the live stream this morning. Elizabeth Goodman, following their deaths 38 years ago, WHC established the Leo and Elizabeth Goodman Public Issues Fund, which co-sponsors lectures and forums in their memory, and we are delighted that in thinking about which speaker, which lecture they were going to sponsor, we are delighted that the family has chosen to sponsor today's lecture, which I know is very meaningful to both Joan and to Lois and to their family, which also includes granddaughters who are often here for this, and I know Lily Landau, Lois and David's daughter, is now an employee at Washington Hebrew as well. So the generations continue to be connected, and we are delighted to have them all here and really appreciate and grateful for their sponsorship of this morning's program. So on to our speaker. Rabbi John L. Rosove is Senior Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Israel of Hollywood in Los Angeles, where he served from 1988 to 2019. He is the past National Chairman of the Association of Reformed Zionists of America, representing 1.5 million American Reformed Jews, and a former national co-chair of the Rabbinic and Cantorial Cabinet of J Street. He is the author of From the West to the East, a memoir of an American liberal rabbi, Why Judaism Matters, Letters of a Liberal Rabbi to His Children and the Millennial Generation, and Why Israel and Its Future Matters, Letters of a Liberal Rabbi to the Next Generation. He is the co-editor of Deepening the Dialogue, Jewish Americans and Israelis Envisioning the Jewish Democratic State. He writes a regular blog at, well, I can give you the link later, but it's www.rabbijohnrosove.blog, and also a blog at the Times of Israel, which, by the way, is one of mine that regularly comes up, so I encourage you to subscribe to that as well. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife, has 2 sons, daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. Most importantly, he is a rabbi's rabbi in so many ways. I have the pleasure when I go to our CCAR conventions, our Reform Rabbinic conventions, of meeting rabbis who often when they find I'm at Washington Hebrew congregation, every now and then someone will say, I was there at some point, and being able to share and have that connection is always really wonderful. Rabbi Rosove might not remember, but I think it was pre-pandemic, we're sitting at a table talking about how to think about the future. And they made a point of scattering people, so we weren't sitting with our classmates, we were sitting with those we did not know as well, who were from different time periods in the rabbinate, and having an opportunity to share our experiences. And I sit down at the table and I look across, and I know exactly who Rabbi John Rosove is. I've heard his name from my very first days here at Washington Hebrew, always, and from many of you, with such love and admiration. And what a delight it was to be able to sit and be in conversation and know that, that we continue to share this special link, and then to be able to have Rabbi Rosove join us today to share his reflections, his perspective, but also in a very meaningful way to think about everything that has been happening over the last 16 months in particular, and how we learn from that and how we can think about what we'll do in the future. What is our Jewish identity post-October 7th? What do we need to do as a Jewish community, not only to heal, but to strengthen our Jewish identity as a collective for the future? And many other reflections that I'm sure will be part of this morning as well. I'm delighted that he's here, having not been here for 37 years. He has never been in the small chapel. So this is a Shehachianu moment. If you'll join with me, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Shehachianu V'kiyamanu V'higianu Lazman Hazeh. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, for giving us life, for sustaining us, and for enabling us to reach this moment. I'm so excited that you are here for this moment, but even more excited to welcome my friend and colleague, Rabbi John Rosove.
So, Rabbi, thank you. It's a very nice introduction. I don't deserve it, but maybe you'll think I do after the fact. But it's so good to be back here at Washington Hebrew. And it's been a long time. The first time I was here was 38 years ago, right about this time, where I spoke in the sanctuary the week that Natan Sharansky was released from the Soviet Union. And I was asked to speak as part of my interview to come to be the associate rabbi with Joe Weinberg, that's starting that July 1st. And I was asked to speak on anything I wanted. And there was only one thing to talk about, which was Natan Sharansky, then Anatoly Sharansky. And I just remember the image, some of you may remember as well. He was told by his Russian captors when the exchange was being made over a bridge between East and West Germany that you will walk straight ahead to the receivers of the Americans on the other side. So what did Natan do? I mean, he was a great resistor. I tell the story of meeting him in my role as the chair of ARTSA when he was the chair of the Sochnut, Jewish Agency for Israel. I was sitting in a committee room in Jerusalem, and there happened to be, my back was to the door, there happened to be a chair next to me that was empty, and I heard someone come in and sit down, and he's a bona fide hero of mine. And I looked to his right, and I was stunned. I've met a lot of people here in Washington and in Hollywood, celebrities, and I've learned not to be starstruck, but I was starstruck. And he's diminutive, brilliant man. But speaking about him, I guess I did well enough because I got the position. So I want to thank as well the Goodman family, Joan and Lois, for sponsoring this, and for all of you, many of whom I haven't seen in all of these years, and it's good to reconnect with you. And it's a real privilege to be here. I wasn't here that long, 2.5 years, but it was an unforgettable experience that I cherish. So much has happened in the Jewish world since then. Today, 38 years after I began my service with you, I want to speak about the historic challenges facing Israel and the American Jewish community, especially since October 7th, and then share some of the broad themes and inflection point stories in my life and rabbinate that I write about in my memoir that I believe have universal takeaways for us all. Today is the 506th day since October 7th. The trauma of that day remains palpable in both Israel and for so many of us as well. Israeli society, despite the release of some hostages, is still frozen by the horrors of that day, arguably the deadliest and most traumatic day for Jews since the Shoah. Border communities bear the scars of destruction and displacement. The trauma of war affects virtually every Israeli in how they relate to their families and with friends and with fellow Jews around the world and with the Palestinians and their Arab neighbors. As much as we Jews are thrilled that some of the hostages are home, we worry about the well-being of the remaining hostages, and we fear that this deal will fall apart any day. Despite the joy of seeing the freed hostages reunited with their families, there's something morally repulsive and offensive in the fact that these innocent Jews and others who were stolen from their bedrooms and from the fields filled with music on that day were exchanged for the very Hamas terrorists who committed the atrocities against our people or who support the murderous Hamas intentions. To see the starving and tortured faces of the 3 hostages released a few weeks ago recalled the old black and white photographs taken when the camps were liberated, which is why President Trump's so-called solution for Gaza was acceptable to Israel's far-right wing. His plan mainstreams for the first time in Israel's history the idea of transfer, a euphemism for ethnic cleansing, without any concern for the rights of the Palestinians living there, most of whom, but not all, of course, were not terrorists, nor were members of Hamas and are suffering. His plan threatens the Egyptian, Israeli, and Israeli-Jordanian peace agreements, the future of the Abraham Accords, the lives of the remaining hostages, and feeds the most extremist, messianic, and illiberal trends in Israeli society. And I know he's backed away from it, but there are people still thinking about it, and it's been mainstreamed in Israel. Just as Israelis find themselves at a significant crossroad in their history, so too do we American Jews find ourselves at a significant crossroad. For the first time in American Jewish history since the founding of the State of Israel, Many liberal American Jews who love the Jewish state have been deeply disturbed not only by what happened on October 7th, but also by Israel's overwhelming and massive military response against Hamas that killed and injured so many thousands of Palestinian civilians and essentially destroyed Gaza. I was one of them. However, in fairness to Israel, it's important for us here to understand that this war, the longest in Israel's history by far, was a response to what the Israeli government and army most feared would happen immediately after October 7th. Israel's leaders believed then that they were fighting for the existence of the Jewish state itself. They knew that Hamas intended to expand its attack, that there were realistic threats also by Hezbollah and Iran to join the war, and that a sympathetic uprising could ignite in the West Bank, forcing Israel to fight simultaneously on 3 fronts. It was unclear then whether Israel could meet those threats. Hamas was organized and executing a plan that it had developed over many years. The IDF was disorganized. The Israeli Army Command believed that it had to distribute immediately its authority to a far lower level of officers than it had ever done before. That decision reduced the IDF's customary safeguards to protect as much as feasibly possible Palestinian civilians who were being used by Hamas as human shields, a war crime to be sure. The Army Command believed that Israel had to fight with overwhelming firepower to disrupt Hamas's chain of command and reach its leaders hiding everywhere under homes, apartment buildings, schools, community centers, hospitals, and mosques. If Israel didn't succeed in disrupting Hamas immediately and demonstrating to Hezbollah and Iran how capable the IDF still was, Israel's military and government leadership feared that tens of thousands of Israelis would be killed. Both Israelis and American Jews are only now beginning to ask about the horrible impact this war has had on both Palestinian civilians and Israelis, and what long-term psychological damage has been done on both peoples. We're trying here in diaspora communities as well to figure out where exactly we stand as American Jews and how much we want to say and reveal publicly about our fears and moral concerns about the war and the illiberal trends in Israel. Taking a 10,000-foot view, which I try to do often in order to get some perspective, the significance of this period in Jewish history is unparalleled in the modern era, except for the 3 years from 1945 to 1948, when the Jewish people went from the lowest nadir after the Shoah to the establishment of Israel. That wide swing of the pendulum is testimony to the Jewish people's durability and ability to survive, adapt, and thrive after catastrophic events. Perhaps the tragedy of October 7th and Israel's turnaround military successes will have a strong deterrent impact on the perceptions of Israel in the media and the hearts of its enemies. Despite Israel's military successes, only a completed ceasefire and hostage deal will bring October 7th to an end and enable Israelis to begin a process of healing, which they have not begun. But any peace deal must include also a pathway to a demilitarized Palestinian state of some kind in Gaza and the West Bank in the context of a larger Middle East peace agreement that includes Israel and Saudi Arabia and all its moderate Arab neighbors. That larger deal won't be easy to attain because right-wing Israeli political parties and the extremist settler movement want to keep the war going as long as possible to enable Israel to annex Gaza and the West Bank into Israel. Should those extremists and messianic forces have their way, more terrorism and more war with the Palestinians and Islamic extremists will be inevitable, and Israel's international standing will remain diminished for decades to come. Thankfully, polling of Israelis today suggests that the grip of the extremist right wing on the Israeli government is weakening. 60 to 70% of all Israelis say they want all 3 stages of the agreement with Hamas to go forward with the return of the hostages and a permanent end to the war, as permanent as it can be. Even if and when that were to happen, there are immense residual problems facing Israel that have to be confronted and resolved, including the massive humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the lack of an Israeli consensus about the role of the Palestinian Authority in the future governance of Gaza and the West Bank, Israel's severely damaged international standing, what we in the American Jewish community think and feel about Israel and Zionism, and the dramatic rise here in anti-Semitism. Among the greatest and immediate internal challenges facing Israel is that it has yet to set up a state commission of inquiry into what happened leading up to October 7th and Israel's conduct in the war. Israel needs a powerhouse authority to undertake this inquiry, to restore the people's confidence that every lesson has been learned, that leadership failings are exposed, conclusions drawn, and whether military excesses and war crimes were in fact committed. In considering Israel's culpability, however, we Jews who love Israel have to be able to distinguish between two kinds of criticism leveled against Israel's conduct of the war. There's criticism from Israel's friends that the IDF went too far, bombed Gaza too heavily, using thousands of those huge 2,000-pound dumb bombs that destroyed entire apartment buildings and neighborhoods to get at Hamas command sites deep underground, thus causing far too much damage to life and property, and that Israeli commanders and soldiers in the heat of battle crossed red lines against international moral standards of war. Israelis need to address this legitimate criticism from Israel's friends and not characterize it as either anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. The second kind of criticism is very different and comes from those who believe that the Jewish state has no moral legitimacy, is a colonial and foreign entity in the Middle East, has no right to exist, and therefore no right to defend itself. That criticism clearly is based upon anti-Semitism. Despite the massive carnage in Gaza, the loss of life and property, the loss of hundreds of young Israeli soldiers, the suffering of the hostages and their families, there have been a few positive things that have come from this war. Immediately after October 7th, Israel's civil society came together across all political and religious lines to support one another, following a year of intensive demonstrations and hatred that brought hundreds of thousands of Israelis into the streets and tore apart the fabric of Israeli society as a consequence of the government's proposed judicial reform efforts or overhaul or judicial coup d'etat, however one characterizes it. In diaspora communities, $1.4 billion was raised for Israel, representing the largest set of contributions on behalf of Israel in our history, and 300,000 Jews and Friends of Israel came together here in Washington in solidarity with Israel, the largest Jewish demonstration since the 1987 Soviet Jewry rally on the Mall. All of that is a source of inspiration and pride. However, the rise of anti-Semitism here and around the world has been dramatic. Between March and May of 2024, Jewish students on 147 campuses in North America were under attack. The ADL counted 10,000 incidents against Jews, representing an increase of 200% over the year before, and that was of a large percentage over the year before that. In a new survey released 3 weeks ago by the ADL and Hillel International, 83% of all North American Jewish students have experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism firsthand since October 7. An American Jewish Committee study reported that over 50% of us won't show in public spaces anything that identifies us as Jews, including wearing kippot, the Magen David, dog tags with the names of Israeli hostages, and yellow hostage ribbons. At the same time, many American Jews have experienced a passionate reconnection to Zionism, Israel, and their Jewish identity. However, 42% of young Jews under the age of 30 have had difficulty finding common ground with the Jewish state. Some, though a minority, now say they are anti-Zionists. Anti-Semitism comes from both the far right politically and the far left. Most of it from the far right, by the way, and conservative movements. The far right doesn't consider American Jews to be part of white America, and that we're foreign interlopers here and with far too much power and influence in government and politics, the media, banking, business, and entertainment. Classic anti-Semitic canards. The far left considers us to be part of white America and in league with right-wing colonialists around the world that oppress peoples of color, most especially in America and Israel. It's unclear what impact October 7 and the war will ultimately have on each one of us and on the character of our traditional Jewish institutions, most especially synagogues, religious schools, and day schools. In the early weeks and months of the war, many Jews sought out the organized Jewish community for themselves and their children. Many non-Jews were choosing to convert to Judaism in numbers greater than we've experienced in a generation. More American Jews began reading books, attending classes, and online seminars that helped them better understand Zionism, Israel, and Middle East politics and history. In the Reform movement, many of my rabbinic colleagues, however, have confessed either that they don't know enough or don't understand well enough what's really happening in Israel to be able to publicly speak and teach with confidence about it. Many who do love and understand Israel have feared for their positions if they spoke critically about Israel's conduct in the war. They've worried that right-wing, wealthy, and influential congregants will take exception to what they say and advocate for their dismissal. Too many synagogues have become unsafe places where rabbis and congregants are unable to discuss and debate openly the wide range of opposing views that exist in our community concerning Israel, Zionism, anti-Semitism, the war, the Israeli government, illiberal trends in Israel and here in American society, and the Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab conflicts. We don't know how our American and Israeli Jewish identities will evolve over time. But my sense is that Jews are in a deeply troubling but also transformative era. Whether in years past, Israelis were happy simply to take diaspora Jewish dollars and seek American Jewish political support for Israel's security needs. In a recent Israeli poll, 80% of Israeli Jews now feel strongly that Israel-diaspora relationships is important to them personally. I characterize myself as a liberal American Reform Zionist and a lover of Israel and the Jewish people. But even as I identify so strongly and closely with Israelis, many of whom are amongst my dearest friends, I've been confused why so many haven't empathized nearly enough with the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza. Rabbi Daniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem raised this issue last month in their weekly podcast, For Heaven's Sake. How many of you listened to that? It's worth listening to. They've done it since the beginning of the war and are very much in tune with everything that's happening as they understand it. They noted that amongst the many challenges Israeli Jews have faced is that in the midst of the war, they felt no significant moral angst about the suffering of Gazans because they themselves felt victimized, first by Hamas's attack on October 7th, and then by the world's remarkably quick turnaround against Israel once the IDF began fighting only days later. Daniel and Yossi explained that victims generally respond to their enemies with fear, anxiety, rage, hostility, and a desire for revenge. And from that embattled position, they morally justify themselves in whatever they do. I confess that in the initial months of the war, perhaps you felt the same way, I felt that way. These terrible effects of feeling victimized explains not only why Israeli society and the Israeli media didn't focus on the destruction of Gaza and the huge loss of life there during the war, but why Palestinian society, too, has historically tolerated and embraced terrorism as a legitimate tool and moral response from their perspective against Israel and the Jewish people. As victims, Palestinians living under Israel's harsh occupation of the West Bank and formerly over Gaza believe that they're justified in committing even the most vicious crimes without moral consequence. At the beginning of the war, a colleague and friend called me distraught because his college-age daughter had joined the Jewish Voice for Peace, an anti-Israel and anti-Zionist Jewish organization. She claimed to want no part of Israel in her life and even expressed the view to her father, a rabbi and Reform Zionist, that Israel should never have been created. My colleague, as you might imagine, was deeply upset and didn't know what to say to her, and he asked me what I thought. A number of my congregants, I'm retired now, but they called me anyway, had the same question about their college age and 20-something kids. And you might remember a letter signed by hundreds of young Reform Jews, children of rabbis, and alumni of the American Reform Jewish summer camps that was published in the Jewish press that accused us older Reform Jewish leadership with hypocrisy, that we taught them liberal universal Jewish values, but now support an illiberal and immoral, as they called it, Jewish state. That letter provoked op-eds, sermons, and conversations throughout our movement about how we Jewish leaders have failed to educate our people, and especially our young Jews, about Israel and Zionism. To my colleague and congregants, I said the following, something of the effect. First, these are your kids. Your relationship with them is what's most important now. Don't say or do anything that will alienate them from you. Love them a lot, which means listening to them without your having to instruct or correct them. Recognize that we're all struggling in this new era of American Jewish history. Take a 10,000-foot perspective and remember that they're at the beginning of their adult journeys as Jews and Americans, and that they'll likely evolve and change their thinking over time, just as we've done over the course of our lives. You've instilled in them the Jewish values that are important to them, to you. This isn't the end of their engagement with Jewish life or in their relationship with Israel. Keep the door open to continuing a conversation with them. They already know, most likely, how you feel and what you believe about Israel. You don't have to persuade them now about anything. Just listen and tell them that you respect them and love them. And if they're open to reading about why Israel matters to the American Jewish community and what liberal American Zionism has to offer them and to Israel as a direct response to the illiberal trends in Israeli society, there are books that deal directly with these challenges. He was somewhat satisfied with what I had to say, but he still had to deal with his daughter. The greater question confronting us here now is, what do we do to better educate ourselves and our young people about Israel and Zionism? That's the $64 million question. The best thing we can do, I think, is to go there individually or in congregational groups and meet Israelis face-to-face with the right, left, and center, with Palestinian Israeli citizens, and with Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank, with Israeli and Palestinian journalists, with members of the Knesset, and with our Israeli Reform Movement rabbis and leadership, and especially with the leadership of the Israel Religious Action Center, whose liberal values we share and who are working every day to counter the extremist actions of the government and on behalf of pluralism, equality, and democracy in Israeli society. Taking a longer view, there are a number of questions we need to be asking ourselves and debating and striving to find consensus. Those questions include the following: how we regard the impact of October 7th and the war on our Jewish lives and institutions, how we memorialize what occurred on October 7th without our identifying as victims, what it means to belong to the Jewish people and to have a Jewish state. These are fundamental questions, but they still need to be asked. How we look at the world today beyond our Jewish agenda and act on behalf of other minorities and groups who may feel towards Jews as colonialists and interlopers. How we regard ourselves as a distinct other in our diaspora communities. How we frame how others ought to be regarding us as American Jews who love Israel. How we rebuild trust in our Jewish institutions and even in many of our clergy and teachers who some young people now regard with a measure of suspicion and distrust because we haven't been honest enough or knowledgeable enough about Israel, the meaning of Jewish peoplehood, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict when they grew up. And finally, how we understand anti-Zionism, anti-Israel sentiment, and anti-Semitism today, and what we do about it. From the 1990s, the organized American Jewish community worked to establish intergroup relationships with the African American, Latino, Asian, Christian, and Muslim communities in America. We worked on writing textbooks and developing curricula together, and we attempted to influence how other groups understood Israel and the American Jewish experience. Today, most of those efforts have been vacated. The American Jewish community is consequently in a shifting place, and though October 7 and the war contributed mightily to that shift, the events of the past 16 months were not the starting points of that shift. There's still, of course, so much that's positive for us to celebrate about the American Jewish experience and opportunities to address the challenges I've mentioned. Our financial resources are very great. We have many talented rabbinic, cantorial, academic, educational, professional, lay, and political leaders helping us forge a new path forward. Our message as American liberal, non-Orthodox Zionists and as lovers of the people and state of Israel has to be clear and unrelenting. Don't give up on Israel. We have a moral Jewish duty to fight for Israel despite her imperfections, just as we fight for America despite its imperfections, to fight for Israel's right to be the only Jewish state in the world, and for Jews to be a free people thriving in our historic homeland without always having to live by the sword. We liberal American Zionists also have a moral duty to fight for Israel to live up to the values articulated in Israel's own Declaration of Independence. We have the duty also to fight against those who constantly defame and delegitimize Israel, who unfairly criticize her and judge her by unreasonable double standards. As Reform Jews, we have the duty to join with our growing Israeli Reform movement in its fight for religious pluralism, democracy, equality, the return of all the hostages, and to pursue a path to peace with the Palestinians, the Arab and moderate Muslim world. One of the most important ways for American Reform Jews to do all of this is to vote in next month's World Zionist Congress elections for the Reform Arts Slate. Rabbi Shankman is a prospective delegate and likely to go if we get enough votes, as am I. I'm sort of a has-been, so I'm way down the list and probably won't. And I hope that you will vote regardless of whether I go or not, but certainly for her in large numbers, so that we will do well in this election. Our liberal Jewish values are at stake in the national institutions, the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency for Israel, and the Jewish National Fund. The World Zionist Organization, for any of you who know anything about these national institutions, dispenses annually $1 billion. And since our Israeli reform institutions are discriminated against by the government of Israel, having a large representation in the WZO will enable more dollars to flow to our reform movement programs in Israel that educate and advocate for a liberal Jewish and democratic values. Though I've articulated some of what I said this morning in my memoir, I want to say a few more words about it. I chose as the title, From the West to the East, a memoir of a liberal American rabbi based on a medieval poem by the 11th century rabbi, poet, and philosopher Yehuda Halevi, who lived most of his life in Muslim Spain and eventually made his way to the land of Israel. He said famously, "Libi b'mizrach v'ani b'kitzei ma'arav." My heart is in the east, and I am at the edge of the west, thereby expressing the age-old longing of the Jewish people for Zion, a longing I've felt since I was a little boy, as parts of both sides of my family made Aliyah. My mother's side in 1878, and my father's side in the mid-1930s. My memoir is organized around many events in my life, including the intense blowback I received to sermons I delivered and actions I took in San Francisco before I came here in DC, and in Hollywood. I write about many causes I took up in my lifelong social justice activism and in my role as the national chairman of ARTSA and as a national co-chair of the Rabbinic and Cantorial Cabinet at J Street. I have a number of important mentors in my life about whom I've written, coming from the Israeli political right, the American political left, the moderate liberal center in both the American Jewish and Israeli Jewish communities. Each of their voices has guided me, and their voices inside my mind and heart often have been at odds with one another, pushing me one way and then another, always sowing doubt, but helping me to clarify my liberal American Jewish and Zionist moral values. I write in my memoir, for example, about a dramatic story at Congregation Shereth Israel in San Francisco in 1980 as a young 30-year-old rabbi, after I delivered a Rosh Hashanah sermon to a packed sanctuary, stopping just short of calling for a Palestinian state. A brawl almost broke out after the service when an Israeli leader of Tel Aviv's right-wing Likud party barged into the group of the synagogue's leaders and me, and took great exception to what I said. I describe another dramatic story here in Washington in 1987, after I delivered another High Holy Day sermon, some of you may recall it, and moral appeal for us to become a sanctuary synagogue on behalf of the 100,000 plus El Salvadoran refugees living in the nation's capital, many of whom were being hunted by Salvadoran death squads, and how I was taken to task in the weeks following Rosh Hashanah by a group of Jewish advisors to then Vice President H.W. Bush. However, I was supported by the former American ambassador to El Salvador, Robert White, who told me to resist the pressure to recant what I said in that sermon, and that he told me that everything I said was 100% accurate. I told the story in 2012 in Hollywood about my then 32-year policy of not officiating at interfaith weddings, and then changing that policy and announcing it on Rosh Hashanah morning, resulting in a surprising standing ovation that didn't stop. I had to ask people to please sit down because there was still fine print that I needed to share with them, and how my decision became for me an inflection point in my life in the rabbinate and an inflection point for the congregation, with congregants crying in the halls and parking lot for weeks afterwards. As only one example, a good friend, an African-American actor married to a Jewish woman, came to me immediately after the service, before I even had a chance to leave the bima, and said, "John, I've always felt welcome here, but now I consider Temple Israel Hollywood my home." I wrote in some detail as well about contemporary anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Israel sentiment, and what it means to raise proudly identifying young Jews today to assure the future of liberal American Jewry and our positive relationship to the people and state of Israel. I wrote about my cancer diagnosis 15 years ago, the overwhelming loving response of my congregation, my coping with what I believed initially was a death sentence, thanks to the brutal way my physician informed me of my condition, and of the pain I suffered during my recovery from surgery, radiation treatment, and a staph infection I picked up in the hospital, and how the experience changed me and made me far more empathic than I had ever been before, and I considered myself an empath to those confronting life-threatening illnesses and chronic pain. I share how we liberal Jews might refocus our faith away from the traditional God King and narrow idea about God that comes to us from tradition, especially the God who doles out rewards and punishment, a classic image in the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic tradition, but instead embrace a mystic model that asks not, do I believe in God, but rather, how might I best experience myself as a spiritual being, based on my long study of Jewish mysticism and the thought and writings of such luminaries as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I wrote about the difference between optimism and hope, that hope is an attitude of the heart and a mindset that helps people endure even the most negative and destructive challenges without denying that reality around us. And what transpired at my family Seder a dozen years ago, in which my millennial sons challenged me, given their pessimistic and at times cynical understanding of contemporary American, Israeli, and world events. I raised them well. I wrote this memoir first and foremost for them, my children and grandchildren, that they might know more about who their father and grandfather was in this fractious and troubled era of Jewish, Israeli, and human history. But I believe that what I've written is relevant for the non-Orthodox American Jewish community and many outside our Jewish tent. My father died when I was 9 years old, and other than a group of letters he wrote to his cousins in Philadelphia during his period of service as a Navy physician during World War II in Hawaii and on Midway Atoll, I have nothing from his hand communicating to me who he was, what he most valued and believed as an American Jew living in the first half of the 20th century, or any details of his parents and grandparents and their immigration to America in the closing years of the 19th century. Not having his reflections and beliefs have been for me a large missing piece of a greater puzzle of my family's life, and I didn't want my grandchildren and their children to have no record of what I've experienced, cared about, valued, and learned that might be of use and importance to them. When I served my congregation in Hollywood, I met with every family a year before each bar and bat mitzvah celebration, and I urged the pre-b'nai mitzvah young people to research with their oldest living relatives their life stories. I gave them a list of 40 questions to ask those family elders. Doing so became for the young people and their parents an enriched experience that offered them greater appreciation for the life experience of the oldest surviving members in their families and their parents and their grandparents, and a larger context for their lives. And if you've not done so yourself in writing, in audio, or video, I urge you to consider it. To have such a record will preserve your memories and lives for the generations to come. And I'd be happy to share with you that list of 40 questions if you email me. My email is easy, my name, JOHNROSOVE, no space, @gmail. Again, my name, @gmail. I'd be happy to send you the list. Finally, I hope you'll acquire a copy of my memoir. For yourselves, your adult children, grandchildren, and friends, whether they be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindi, or without faith tradition, who are open to expanding how they think about their lives in this era and what possibilities this period in our history holds for each of us and the Jewish people. Again, thank you for being here. Thank you to the Goodman family for sponsoring this, to Rabbi Shankman. And now I am open to her questions and yours.
You already answered one of my questions, but we're going to go into more detail, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. Thank you. Really, thank you for sharing this morning and also giving just a little bit of a teaser into the book itself, but having read it, I can tell you, hopefully your interest is piqued by some of those sort of sneak peeks at some of those stories, but really it is relevant, I think. It's not just a memoir for your children and grandchildren, but it is for all of us, especially in this moment, but even without the last 16 months, I think is a wonderful, not only example, but you share incredible insights into not just the life of the rabbinate, but the life of the American Jew, and our history, our struggles, and I encourage you all to read it and also to share with others, and to begin those stories, our own personal stories, to share them with the next generation. So one of the biggest struggles I think we're facing, and I know you did speak about this a little bit, is, and by the way, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and I know many of you will have questions, so in a moment we'll come out to you. How can we engage the next generation to really have that relationship with Israel and supporting Israel? We talk about it. I mean, we all struggle with it. This is a major conversation. In fact, I'll be going early to our next CCAR convention for a fellowship for rabbis who really want to dive even deeper into thinking about how we engage that next generation to enter the tent, to not distance themselves. How do we bring our community closer and recognize that our synagogues, the intention is for it to be a safe place to talk about Israel. And when we stand up, and as I know you've watched my Rosh Hashanah sermon about Israel, I felt it was important at that moment to express those strong feelings, and also inviting the conversation, which I've also had with those who feel differently. But we're all at a loss. What can we do?
Yeah, well, I don't have any magic potion. Your sermon was exactly what should be happening in every synagogue. It was honest, it was open, you didn't mince words, but you left, how many of you heard the sermon? Okay, it's on your website, or maybe on YouTube, I don't know.
On our YouTube channel, it's the Erev Rosh Hashanah.
But that conversation has to, while we have kids here already, particularly starting probably in the 5th or 6th grade, but certainly by junior high and high school, we should be getting people to Israel, taking family trips. Birthright Israel was a great program, still is. The problem with it is that it never showed the underbelly of Israeli society to anyone. J Street had such a mission it couldn't afford what Birthright did. And they showed the good and the not so good. And kids came back feeling, oh, so that's what's going on. There are J Street U chapters on 45 or 50 campuses around the country with very thoughtful, the cream of the crop of our young people in college. So if you have grandchildren or children who are going to Jewish areas where there's a J Street U, I urge them, whether they end up staying with it or not. I mean, there are other strong pro-Israel organizations, but what I find in many of the strong middle right, right-wing Jewish organizations is that they won't deal with the underbelly at all. Honestly, the way we deal with the underbelly of America. I mean, to be an American citizen means you have to deal with what's happening here, to be knowledgeable about it, and to seek the facts, not alternate realities, and to deal with problems as best we can, politically, educationally, professionally as possible. So in our schools, we need teachers and rabbis who can really speak truth to the kids while keeping the door open for other views. And if that means bringing people in to debate, which I did when I was the rabbi at Temple Israel, I brought in Jeremy Ben-Ami, the president of J Street, and Peter Beinart, for some of you, before he went AWOL. But I didn't bring them in alone. I brought them in with right-wingers who would debate them. And as it turns out, both Jeremy and Peter were just far smarter and just, washed the floor with them. But nevertheless, to acknowledge that there are two sides. There's a member of my congregation who I was very close to, and still am. He's about a month younger than me, and he was I don't know whether I tell this story in the book or not, but I had a Friday morning men's Torah study that went on for many years with a lot of people, and he was a regular, an Israeli. And he came and then suddenly stopped coming. So a month after his absence, I called him and I said, Ailey, why haven't you come? He said, I can't talk to you now. So another month went by, I called him back and I said, are you ready to talk? He said, come over for lunch. Now, Ailey was a commander of the Navy SEALs in the Yom Kippur War. I was in Israel during the Yom Kippur War. My first year rabbinical school was 73 to 74. And I remember what he had described to me. He was the commander, he was ordered by Ariel Sharon to take his 100 men and to create a bridge over the Nile, to take Israel's tanks across the Nile to surround the Egyptian army. Do you remember that battle? It was a horrible battle. And he told Sharon, you're not my commanding officer. I refuse to do it. So there was one level down from Sharon, and I forget the guy's name. He was a general as well. And so he went to Ailey and he said, you must do this. He said, if I do it, all my men are going to get killed. It's not worth it. He said, okay, Ailey, you have 30 seconds to decide whether you're going to do this or not. And if you decide not to, I'm going to relieve you of your command, and we'll have somebody else do it. So he said, okay, I'll do it. He lost half his men, but he was successful. And Ailey stopped coming to my Torah study because he didn't like that I was in J Street. And we talked about it. He said, look, John, I agree with you on everything you're saying, but you're an American Jew. You have no business speaking publicly in the American Jewish community about what we're doing in Israel. And I said, okay, look, I was coming a month or two later, I was at a national conference of J Street here in DC. And I scheduled a Shabbat dinner after our service one night in which I was going to report on what I learned. And I said, look, I want you to come and I will give you the podium and sit down and you say whatever you want. He said, yeah, right. And I said, no, I'm serious. You come, if you're there, I will give you the podium. And he came and he did. And he was respectful, but pretty strong. And that was a message to the congregation, that there needs to be healthy debate, a safe place for this kind of thing to go on at every level of our community. Now, with kids who are in college and in their 20s, college, I know, I mean, if there's a J Street U chapter, that is probably the best place for them to go to be able to think through the tough issues that Israel presents and Zionism presents. But if they're out of college, I don't know. I don't have an answer. I don't have a full answer as to how we draw curriculum about how to do this. It means bringing Israelis in of many different perspectives, but also getting our people to Israel. I used to take trips of my congregants. There were family trips as well that I took in my early years, but my associate would take the family trips, and then every 3 years I would take a group of adults, and it was a 10-day trip, and I told them to sleep before they come, and they could sleep on the plane leaving, but they weren't going to get much sleep while we were there. And we were going from breakfast to late at night, talking to everybody. And I remember one of the smartest guys a lawyer in my congregation, he was also on our board, and after a while I just said to him, look, I need you to talk at the beginning of a board meeting, not the end, because then we could all go home earlier. Because he was so brilliant, he could synthesize everything that people said that we had. After about 4 or 5 days of this trip, people's minds were exploding. He said, we need a debriefing. So we got a room in the hotel, and I said, okay, let's go around, everybody say whatever you want. He was, of course, the last one to speak. He says, you know, everybody's right. And that's the rub.
So as many of you know, we just returned about 3 weeks ago. Is it even 3 weeks? about 3 weeks ago, we took a leadership trip, an adult trip to Israel with a number of board members, some past presidents, and some of our Israel Engagement Committee. So about 15 of us went all together. On March 10th, which is the opening of our spring session for Mondays at Macomb, we'll have an opportunity before dinner that evening for those who would like to come and hear a little bit more about that trip, because what it sparked is we need to do this. We've had family trips for years, but we need to do this more often. We need to have opportunities for adults to go to not just be in Israel, and particularly in this moment, it was important, but also to really have a full sense. And you'll hear, some of you have already heard from our president, Jeff Weiss, in 12 to 14-hour days, and you're learning, it's constant. There's so much, and we're taking advantage of every possibility, and we're talking about our next trip, probably next January or February. So we'll be going back for those. I know some of you already, you were not able to make it this year. You're going to join us next year, but it was really for those who went, I believe it was these were the terms used, transformative, life-changing. Many of them had been to Israel before, a few who had never been, but even to connect, to talk to Israelis everywhere we went, not just the speakers, but to hear about October 7th, about the war, about this moment, about democracy, all of the questions that we're grappling with, that our Israeli brothers and sisters are grappling with. So just mark that in your head. March 10th, you'll see more about it. And also our colleague, Rabbi Nama Daphne from Or Hadash congregation in Haifa, our sibling, our twin congregation, will be here at the beginning of April again to visit with us. So just wanted to let you know about those upcoming opportunities. One of the things that was fascinating, and then we're going to turn to questions from you. One of the things that I thought was very interesting, I know that there has, many have suggested pathways to peace for Israelis and Palestinians, and peace for the Middle East. I would love if you would share a little bit about a proposal that you have for a confederated, you touched on this a little bit, about how we could potentially get to peace. There are many who are saying that now the two-state solution is off the table. What is a possibility for peace?
Yeah, well, one of and I not only argue for this option, but also argue against it, because it's very unclear whether it could work. I asked my friend Yossi Klein Halevi what he thought of it. I'll tell you what it is in a minute. And he said, ideally it's good, but he worries about security. Now that, if you know who Yossi Klein Halevi is, he comes out of the Jewish Defense League, Meir Kahane. He's now in the middle right of the Israeli political spectrum, brilliant writer, and he's spoken here, I imagine. So it's called confederal two-state solution that works very much the way the European Union works. The borders are clearly set, but they're not blocked. And any Israeli Jew living in the West Bank that becomes part of the state of Palestine would be citizens of the state of Palestine, but also citizens of Israel. So they would vote in local elections and vote in national elections in Israel. But they would be under the sovereignty of Palestine with its own security concerns. Same thing with the Palestinians living in Israel. Even Palestinian Israeli citizens, if they chose at this point to be Palestinian citizens, they could vote in local elections in the state of Israel, but not national elections, and they could vote in national elections in the state of Palestine. Palestine would have its own government, its own currency, its own foreign policy, but it would be demilitarized. It would have its own security forces that would be coordinated with Israel's security forces, as is currently happening in the West Bank, by the way. And though there's a lot of violence and a lot of Israeli, attacks going on, seeking out Hamas people in the West Bank, that security relationship has worked pretty well over time. There are, of course, great risks. The violent right wing of the Israeli population and the violent Islamic terrorists of the Palestinians would have to be dealt with by the security forces. But the only way for Israel to remain a Jewish state and a democracy is for there to be two states. So this idea of a confederal two-state solution was devised by Palestinians and Israelis together. It's called a land for all. Actually, there are two versions. One is led by Yossi Beilin, former deputy prime minister and head of the Labor Party in the 90s, and worked on the Oslo Accords and the Geneva Accords that never have gone into fruition, and a Palestinian leader with the last name of Husseini. However, I mentioned as well the writings of I forget her first name, but two writers, Wilf, who was an Oslo proponent, but believes now that the Palestinians as a whole, certainly the leadership, intend for there to be no Israel. And so it's a pipe dream to even think that a two-state solution is possible. And so that's the rub. This is an impossible situation. And for those who are really critics of Israel, they need to be equal critics of Palestinians, because if they're not, they're being unfair. And there's so much good in Israel. How many of you have been to Israel? Okay, virtually everybody. How many of you have been more than once? How many of you live there? Any Israelis here? Okay. So you know Israel. How many of you follow the news pretty closely? How many of you listen to the Times of Israel daily podcast? That's a must, right? It's 20 minutes, 25 minutes, excellent reporting.
It's the perfect amount of time if you're driving from Macomb Street to Julia Bindeman Suburban Center or back.
Or if you're brushing your teeth and getting dressed in the morning. And Yossi Klein Halevi and Daniel Hartman's podcast, For Heaven's Sake, it's called, is also terrific. And there are a bunch of them. The Haaretz podcast with Alison Kaplan, Summer, is superb. She drops every Friday, I think, or Thursday, and she interviews great people. And the Promise podcast, which is another, those are all friends of mine, so I listen religiously. They're really smart.
Thank you. I want to go to questions from you all. I have one final question at the end, and I know we want to have time for those who want to have books signed. So, yes. Let me bring the microphone that way. We can make sure our friends joining us on live stream can hear as well.
Hi, I have a granddaughter who's a senior in Georgetown. She spent a gap year in Israel. She signed up for Birthright. But she has a hard time understanding what's happening in Gaza. And she has a hard time talking to Palestinian students at Georgetown, trying to explain her allegiance to Israel, but accepting that what's happening in Gaza, she cannot understand. What do I tell her?
Okay, well, first, a great book for her to read is Yossi Klein Halevi's Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which explains who he is as an Israeli and a Zionist. It's very clear. It's now translated into Arabic, English, written English and Arabic. It's superb. My second book is Why Israel Matters, Letters of a Liberal American Rabbi to the Next Generation. I deal with a lot of the issues, some of which I touched on today, but that might be a good read for her. Also, The Promised Land by
Ari
Shavit.
Which many of you might remember we had as a congregational conversation. We read it, we did a congregational read, and and dialogue over the course of the year.
It's a terrific book, his personal life notwithstanding. Those of you know. But the book is superb and particularly deals with the 1948 war and some of the things that the Israeli army did. And with regards to Gaza, I don't know. I write an epilogue. I'd finished writing the book, and my publisher said to me, he's an Armenian whose family his grandparents were refugees from the Armenian genocide. So he really resonated with the book and with me. He was also my editor. After the book was finished and October 7th happened, he said, John, you have to write an epilogue. I said, do I have to? I mean, it was so impossible. And he said, you have to, and you have to deal with this as honestly as you can, which I did. Now, that wrapped in November or December. So a lot has evolved since then. But that epilogue says a lot on behalf of what is happening in Gaza, what is happening in Israel, some of this which I've shared this morning. The fact of the matter is, until there is an official inquiry by Israel itself of what happened in Gaza, Israel does not have a leg to stand on. It has to do this. Bibi doesn't want it to happen because it'll threaten his government and it'll threaten him. So he has a whole range of self-interests that are preventing this true investigation, which always happens after a major disaster. Happened after the '73 war, and it certainly has to happen after this war is over and the hostages are home. But he's delaying it. So unfortunately, you can argue some of the points that I argued to your granddaughter, that at least in the initial months of the war, Israel was terrified. The Israeli government and the IDF were terrified that Israel was going to be overtaken on 3 fronts and had to demonstrate overwhelming force to deter any of the other Hezbollah, which started bombing immediately on October 8th. I mean, that war began much earlier, but Israel didn't respond in kind until much later. They had finished more or less what was going on in Gaza. So, it's very complicated, and your granddaughter should just accept the fact that she's going to be very uncomfortable. Jews should be uncomfortable. We are not a comforting people. We are Yisrael, the ones who struggle. So for us to look for comfort is an anomaly in our history. We just are not that way. And you can tell her, if she's uncomfortable, she's a Jew. I mean, this is, and she's a good Jew. She doesn't have to have definitive answers, but it doesn't mean giving up on Israel either.
Yeah, I'm going to throw a bomb, so forgive me, but great summary, great description of where we are. This is a brief Trump question, not to get political, but in anti-Semitism, we've looked for allies in other communities. We're now facing a dilemma or a situation where Trump is being supportive of Israel and the administration, but attacking LGBT, attacking diversity, attacking immigration, and other communities that have traditionally been allies of this congregation. How do we walk a line? And was it Pastor Niemeyer that said, first they came for the socialists and I wasn't a socialist, then they came for me. What should our position be as a congregation?
Well, as a congregation, I don't know. I mean, you've got a lot of Jews in this congregation. So, you don't have to have a position as a congregation. Excuse me. A broken clock is right twice a day, right? So some of what Trump is saying vis-a-vis Israel isn't bad for us, although what he's proposing is immoral, it's illegal, taking over Gaza. Although he says no American troops are going to go, and his owning it, I mean, he's looking at it as a real estate deal. It's a stupid proposal and an immoral one. But he supports Israel, which that part of it I like. But the kind of support that he has for Israel supports and enables Bibi and the right wing, which will never come to any kind of conclusion about how to deal with the Palestinian question long term. So that's the problem with his positions. He said just in the last few days, whatever Israel wants to do, continue the war or to finish the war. I mean, this war has to end. I mean, Israel has won the war. It hasn't wiped out Hamas, and it never will. It's really a question of management going forward. And Israel's always going to have to be on guard, which is what October 7th has shown. So anyway, those are just some brief thoughts. I don't know if that helps at all. Julie.
Thank you. I find it really difficult to have conversations with people when they start with the presumption, one, that I want Gazans to die, and I feel like that's a form of blood libel to suggest that and to initiate that conversation. And I also find it challenging when people appear to begin with no sympathy at all for what it might be like to live in a community that has, being murdered and have babies baked and things. It seems to jump over that. So I don't know how to have conversations when people initially just begin with criticism of Israel and the presumption that I want innocent people to die. So how do we engage with that?
Okay, well, my brother is a brilliant physician, and he's right-wing on Israel. And after the Bibas babies were brought back to Israel, he wrote me an email that made my blood curdle. And he's an oncologist, a professor of medicine at UCLA, world-renowned. And when it comes to Israel, he's blind. And I don't talk about Israel with him. There's nothing to be had. And it's hard because he keeps sending me things. And I've told him more than once, please stop sending me. I'm reading a lot. I know what's going on. What you're sending me isn't helping. Please stop. Just stop. So that's one response. So to those people who are insensitive to Israeli suffering, in a way, the question is, do they believe that Israel has a right to exist? Ask them that question. Do they support the fact that Israel is an indigenous nation, that we come from there, that we're not colonialists, that we are, that we belong there? Ask them if they believe that. And if they don't, say, you know what, we have nothing to discuss.
By the way, this wonderful exchange, just for those who are not in on it's not really a secret, is that Rabbi Rosove officiated Julie's bat mitzvah 37 years ago. So it's nice I'm sure you engaged in some meaningful discussions then, and wonderful to see those continue. I know we're over time. I know there are many more questions, so we're just going to take one or two more because we also want to give people an opportunity to purchase the book and to have those signed as well.
In a somewhat offbeat question, it's been upsetting me for many, many years that about 60 years ago, 1 million Jews had to leave Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Morocco, their homes, who had been living there for 400 years. They dispersed throughout the entire world and resettled and did their thing. Why doesn't the world know about this? Nothing is ever said about the 1 million Jews that had to leave their homeland, who had been there for 400 years. They left their homes, their businesses, everything, and walked out with nothing. Why doesn't the world know this?
I talk about that in the book. I'm walking.
So you're going to buy the book and read it.
Very quickly. I'm walking with one of my dear friends who's from Cairo. And we had just visited Sheikh Jarrah, which I talk about, what the significance of it, which is a suburb of Jerusalem, on the East Jerusalem. And after that day, he and I are walking up with our group up the road towards the Jaffa Gate. And he says, John, I lost everything. My family lost everything in 1956 in Egypt. Everything was nationalized. I lost everything. We're not asking for compensation for our losses. Why do the Palestinians continue to ask for this? So the Israelis know it, but they don't talk about it. It was discussed, I believe, during the Clinton, the Camp David discussions. I think it was discussed, but nothing came of it. People don't know because Israel is the victor. You know, Israelis are the victors in the Middle East. And who's going to be sympathetic to them? Although if there ever is to be a larger deal with the Abraham Accords and maybe what Jeremy Ben-Ami now calls a 23-state solution, which includes a Palestine and a Western alliance with all the moderate Arab nations, maybe it'll get addressed. I don't know. It's a good question.
Rabbi, I'd like to know, do you know if there's an underground in Gaza, or did anyone of the 20,000 that used to come into Israel to work every day, did anybody reveal anything to the Israelis generally about October 7th? Thank you.
Oh, good question. Clearly, a lot of those workers were giving to Hamas the layout of kibbutzim and the areas where Jews lived, so they knew exactly where to go. I don't know how many of them are alive. You know, Israeli intelligence may know. I don't know.
So a final question for in here, bless you. You talked a little bit about your role with ARTS, so the Association of Reformed Zionists of America. You mentioned there's an election upcoming, as my husband, Rabbi Michael Namath, often says, and a lot of this campaign is going through the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism, where Michael works. But he says this is the most important election you've never heard of. You've heard of it now, but the important thing is not only for all of us to vote, and this is not about my being elected. I'm part of the slate. Rabbi Schmelkin's on the slate. David Astrow, for those of you who know, a past president, is on the slate. Rachel Erlbacher, who's a current member of our board, is also. It is really a way for us to make sure that our voice as Reformed Jews is heard in Israel, but also because all of the values that we cherish here are at risk and certainly under threat in Israel. And it's not just about Reformed Judaism. We'll be working with the conservative movement and others who share similar values, but also there certainly is in this moment there are those who are like, we could share campaign videos with you about what some of the ultra-Orthodox are saying about the threat of Reformed Judaism in Israel. So it's crucial that we're all voting, but not only that. If you know anyone who is Jewish, who is over the age of 18, they do not need to be a member of Washington Hebrew Congregation or any congregation. They are eligible to vote in this election. And the cost of the election to vote is only $5. You're going to hear more about this from Washington Hebrew. The voting kicks off on March 10th, which is that same night. We'll be here for Mondays at Macomb, and you'll hear more about our Israel trip. Please just note your calendar, look it up. You can sign up now to be reminded to vote, and you'll see more coming out from Washington Hebrew. But the elevator pitch on that, I gave it. Great.
Although the only other thing I would add is this is really vital for the Israeli Reform Movement, which is in arrears $1 million now. They've lost since October 7th $1 million supporting 45 congregations and about 140 rabbis ordained, Israeli rabbis ordained by the Reform Movement in Israel. And for our values to be disseminated really as a vanguard of all the values that we hold dear here and that they hold dear, they need the income to be able to do that work. And 39% of all of the seats in the World Zionist Congress are from the United States. The Reform movement is the largest American Zionist party. So if we do well, and there's another slate that some of you may be solicited to vote on behalf of, Tikva slate, which is the progressive Zionist slate in America. I ask you, please, and they're a part of me, I'm a part of them, but please vote for the Reform slate, because for them there's no money involved. For us, for our movement in Israel, they depend on the funds that are going to come, and also for positions of power in the Jewish institutions. The Jewish national institutions, when I was the Archer chair, I got a crash course on them. It's very complicated. You know, it goes back to the time of Theodore Herzl and Ben Gurion and all of that. I mean, it's a historic, pre-state legislative bodies of the Jewish world. And it's very exciting, very confusing, and very wrought. Being in meetings, and I hope you'll go, you will be so turned off by the Mizrahi right-wing Orthodox because they're mean, they're nasty, and that's what our movement is dealing with. And we have to stand up to them.
We have there's a Reform rabbi who is a member of Knesset, Gilad Kariv. Our group actually met with him in the Knesset while we were there. There are people, other members of Knesset, who walk by him who won't talk to him. He just got an appointment as chair of an important committee, maybe on immigration and.
I don't know, but Gilad is smarter than virtually everybody else. Mm-hmm. That's the truth. And he's as smart a politician as I've ever met here or there. And so we're being led well by him. He used to be the executive director of the Israel Movement for Reform Judaism. But,
and now he's representing us there, which is wonderful. You're going to hear more about it. If those of you who would like to, while you're waiting, I'll come down the line as you're waiting to buy a book. I can show you the website so you can at least be ready. But it's Vote Reform. It's the third slate on the list. I believe that is correct.
Yes. The World Zionist Organization is the broad thing. If you vote Reform, it's the third political party on the list. Vote Reform. Reform or Arza.
And I'm happy to, and certainly Rabbi Schmelkin, Cantor Bortnick when she's back from her sabbatical, and Rachel Erlbacher, David Astrof, any of us are happy to explain more about why this is so important, what's at stake. And this is really about our connection to Israel and having our voice, making sure that our voices are heard there. And the most important thing is the impact it will have, not just right now, but for the future. And that is truly important. And we thank you for your inspiration and how we can think about the future. And we hope it won't be as many years in between visits.
Thank you. It's nice to be back, and thank you all.
Thank you.